Yes.
Mr. Mellor, last leg. As you know, these are questions which have been put forward by core participants, and so inevitably we will jump from topic to topic.
I understand. Don't worry.
I will try to put them in some form of order, but please do say if you
No problems.
would like to be orientated. I'd like to begin with a couple of questions about clinical freedom and the role of the Chief Medical Officer. The inquiry has heard a lot of evidence from people who worked in the Department of Health about the importance that was attached in the 1980s to the concept of clinical freedom and doctors being able to prescribe and treat patients in the way that they saw fit. Was that a principle that you were aware of during your time as Minister of State?
Yes, very much so, particularly in relation, say, to GPs, where, what we were trying to do was to get GPs' surgeries up to date, and also where the NHS became a genuine national health service and not just a national sickness service. In other words, to try to offer people who thought they were well tests of various kinds. And the number of GPs who, particularly often elderly ones, who would operate out of lock-up shops in inner city areas, and their right to clinical independence was defended not just by them, but by the BMA. It was a source of considerable tension.
What was your view on the importance of clinical freedom?
Well, it depends what you mean by clinical freedom. I mean, the freedom for a clinician to make a judgment as to, for instance, what treatment he wanted to give a patient. I think that's very important, even though it can sometimes be inconvenient to the NHS if we're dealing with expensive prescribing. I mean, I don't believe that someone should be allowed to prescribe a branded product when there are equally good non-branded ones available. But basically, being a doctor is always going to be something where individuality is going to be significant, and a lot of people go to a doctor because they like his individual ways or her individual ways. I do find, though, that clinical freedom was quite difficult to defend in a number of instances. The instance I've given about often inner city GP practices that were simply awful. I mean, little better than lock-up shops, and that was totally contrary to what we thought was in the best interest of the NHS. And obviously, also clinical freedom. One of the other big problems when I was at the department was the difference between performances of various hospitals and various surgeons. You know, you could get a man like Magdi Yacoub, who's one of the finest men I've ever met, who would do 2 or 3 highly complicated heart operations in a day. And then you get 1 or 2 places, probably they're better now than they were, but where a general surgeon, you know, a sort of real hammer and chisel person, would do a couple of operations a week. Now, that is not, in my view, an exercise of clinical freedom. That's an exercise in breach of the norm, where if the NHS is ever going to do what it ought to do and be successful, there have to be standards that have to be maintained, and you have to expect a certain level of output from each person that's employed there. That probably isn't the answer, that I'm probably rambling a bit, but you know, clinical freedom is something that can be used for a whole lot of different purposes, a long way away, I suspect, from what the creators of the phrase had in mind.
How would the ministers of the Department of Health and the Chief Medical Officer seek to intervene if it was felt necessary to issue guidance? And do you think that that was done with sufficient rigour?
Well, I'm not quite sure what we're talking about here. The Chief Medical Officer wouldn't really play a part in that. The Chief Medical Officer was available to deal with issues, and I increasingly thought to deal with issues where public confidence turned on the authority of the person who was giving the advice. And I took the view that the more the CMO could do, the better, because you know, he was someone who automatically commanded respect, and no one thought he had some ulterior political motive. So far as actually managing the NHS, that was always going to be a subject of controversy, but he wouldn't have done a lot of that.
What about the Dear Doctor letters that the CMO sometimes sent around to all doctors or doctors in a specific category?
Yes.
Giving guidance or advice about particular themes. Was that something that you felt was used enough by the CMO?
I have no view about. I have no idea how often it was used, but certainly, I come back to the point. If medical advice is best issued by a doctor, and so if the CMO thought that there was an issue which needed to be drawn to the attention of the wider community, far better he did it, either than that a bureaucrat within the NHS did it, or a minister. Because, half the world would be against a minister, whatever he said.
Let's move on to the Mcfarland Trust. And I've been asked to raise with you a specific example that was given in evidence of a request that was turned down by the Mcfarland Trust, which was for a motorised car as a toy for a dying 7-year-old boy. In your view, acknowledging that the Mcfarland Trust was independent, but in your view, as Minister of State, is that the kind of award that the Mcfarland Trust should have been making?
I can't really comment on that because I don't know the circumstances. But anything a 7-year-old child wants is not something you'd want to withhold if it wasn't expensive. But I have no complaints about them in my brief period there, what the Mcfarland Trust did. But, they have to make their own minds up. And it's not for me to sit in judgment, either when I was a minister or certainly now that I'm not.
Let's move then to the HIV litigation. And I'm going to bring a document up. It is one which is referred to in your witness statement.
Yeah.
At 7.8, paragraph 7.8,
Right.
page 53. We could have the document on screen, please. HMTR 603_022. This is not a document that you would have seen at the time because it's correspondence between officials, an official at the Welsh office and Mr. Grice from the Treasury. It concerns the settlement of the HIV litigation. It's dated the 2nd of July 1991. Paragraph 2 of this, if we could expand that, please. What the official from the Welsh office says is this: I must say that we are somewhat surprised that an arrangement of this nature should have been reached without the Secretary of State for Wales being consulted. I have no wish to make a great fuss about the matter, not least because everyone here seems to be fairly confident that the £47 million that the Treasury is making available will prove to be sufficient. But I feel I should point out that if in the event additional costs are incurred, and some of these relate to AIDS victims living in Wales, my Secretary of State will not necessarily feel bound by an agreement to which he has not at any stage been made a party. It would seem to be there a comment that because the HIV settlement had been reached through an agreement with the Department of Health and yourself as Chief Secretary, without consulting the territorial departments, that they would not feel bound to top up any sums that proved necessary.
That's just positioning, isn't it? We'll go into the category P&W, piss and wind.
In terms of what was arranged for the HIV litigation, that does seem to have been funded centrally and from the reserve, as we have discussed, at least in terms of the substantive amounts going to the plaintiffs rather than going to the lawyers. We've also seen that in the later extension to people who did not have haemophilia but who had been infected with HIV, the Welsh office were asked to contribute and offered to contribute.
I don't want to stop your enthusiasm, and you remain remarkably fresh after all these hours. I'm not very fresh. Do you know what? Discussions about the Welsh office, I think I'll go to Stamford Bridge a bit earlier than I'd intended.
Can we take it from that the position of the Welsh office was not one which was at the forefront of your mind
No, I
during the
don't
settlement
think,
of
I
the
don't
HIV
remember
litigation?
ever having read a document from the Welsh office in my time at the Department of Health. I appreciate I wouldn't get away with that today. But there are some things officials have to be left to do. And bless their hearts, I've nothing against the Welsh. My partner is a large percentage Welsh, but I don't allow that to bias me against Wales, that she is largely Welsh. So, you know, what can I say? You know.
We'll pick up the question of Welsh office funding with another witness. If we move on then to the settlement, I've been asked to ask about your evidence earlier that when agreeing a litigation settlement, you would expect the litigants to give up the right to sue on the same issue
Yes.
at the later court.
A much more serious point. Yes.
Something which you said in your statement as well.
Yes.
As a matter of principle, would you agree that any such waiver of the future right to sue should come on the basis that all relevant and material facts, insofar as they are known, were on the table at the time when that waiver is given?
Well, I'm not sure what the small print was of that, but I certainly would think that if the circumstances change, then, well, it's a slippery slope, isn't it? I'm going to plead I'm not guilty on that one. It was not something I had to do with the detail of. And, but generally, as a legal principle, you and I would agree, if material circumstances change, and so should the opportunity for a different outcome. But the trouble is, that opens the way for any amount of special pleading. One of the things I was quite certain of was that, you know, in life you have to make choices. If people wanted to take their chances with the courts and could get legal aid, which was not controlled by us, and you know, people go for legal aid and they either get it or they don't on the perceived legal merits of what they're trying to say. That's one thing. But one of the things we couldn't do was pay what, you know, was quite an expensive settlement, and then people could say, well, we'll take that, but we still want the right to go and sue. But I don't know the detail of that, I'm afraid. It would never have come across my desk.
And at that time, of course, you were Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
Yes.
So that was a matter that would have been dealt with perhaps by others, particularly in the department.
Yes, well, you know, the Treasury was a classic example of a department where, you know, ministers had to be used sparingly because there was just so much ground to cover.
Perhaps also relevant to note that the lawyers instructed in the case were instructed by the Department of Health and
Yes.
not by the Treasury.
Yes.
On the settlement and the way in which it was announced, we know that the Prime Minister made a statement on the 11th of December 1990
Yes.
announcing the settlement.
Announcing the settlement.
Or announcing the proposal for the settlement,
Yes.
I think is
Yes.
a better way of putting it. Do you know how far in advance he would have had to have given an indication of his intention to make that announcement to the Commons?
Probably just a matter of hours.
More generally, do you have any insight or knowledge as to why the Prime Minister changed his position, it seems, between initially agreeing with the Treasury proposal and later agreeing to Mr. Walgrave's
I don't
proposal?
know. You're saying he did. I'm not sure about that. You mean that he basically was of the view, I mean, I think it's a minor matter anyway, but he was basically of the view that the announcement should make clear what we thought was important, and an agreement had not been reached until it had. Maybe he then thought, I don't know, I'm just unsighted completely on that.
Just a final question on this then, and drawing on your general memory and general sense of the time. Do you have any recollection or any feeling that the Prime Minister had somehow been bounced into that by Mr. Waldegrave?
No, I don't think so. I think that John was quite hard to bounce, actually. But I think he had sympathy with the position in which William Waldegrave and various of his predecessors would find themselves, because in terms of the politics, being Secretary of State for Health was and is and remains one of the most difficult briefs, and no Prime Minister is sensible not to do their best to help them out, as long as it's not too expensive.
You say that the Prime Minister was difficult to bounce. From your experience of him, was Mr. Waldegrave much of a bouncer? If I put it that way.
No, I'm going to plead the Fifth Amendment here. There is things I can say, but I'm going to remember the Confucian edict that if what you have to say is not more wonderful than silence, shut up.
We will, of course, hear from Mr. Waldegrave, and we can put these questions to him. Perhaps not that one, but let's move on then to a distinct element which runs through both the HIV litigation and the Mcfarland Trust. In your role, both as Minister of State at the Home Office and as Chief Secretary, what appreciation did you have, knowledge did you have of the position of the wives and partners of those people who have been affected, and how any settlement or any payments through the Mcfarland Trust would affect them?
I think that it was always hoped and expected that when someone had family obligations, those would be taken into account when determining what grant assistance was appropriate. Plainly, it would have an impact on every aspect of the family life of the affected person, and I would expect anybody making any judgments about assistance to be aware of that. It's a very taxing thing for families, and for those who are close to someone who's going through all of that, awful.
So it was something that was in your mind when discussing these matters at the time?
It would certainly have been in my mind, but as I say, one of the reasons why the trust was set up independent of us and consisted of a number of people with experience of that kind was that they would have regard to all of that. But in making the financial provision that was made, I seem to remember we referred to a document, I can't recall exactly which one it was, which made the distinction between an individual and someone who had dependents.
Certainly, there was at the time of the HIV litigation settlement, there were different categories with different sums attached, and the sum for somebody who had dependents was different to somebody who did not. I've been asked to ask about comments that you made earlier about commercial blood products from America. Were you aware at the time that there were also people with haemophilia who had been infected with blood products manufactured in the United Kingdom?
No, I wasn't. I had, you see, don't forget that was before, but I wouldn't be at all surprised, because it is, why would it be confined to America? But I would be instinctively more suspicious than some about the provision of medical products from America where they are commercially traded and bought from the less privileged part of society. But I'm sure I was not at all surprised to know there were problems with the UK as well.
Do you think any of your attitudes at the time would have been any different had you had a greater awareness of the role of domestic products?
No, because I was not. I was not drawing any conclusions because they came from America. I was simply making the point that I personally would be more troubled about them coming from America, but that has no impact on any policy. It's just an observation.
Moving on to hepatitis, something that is referred to in your statement relatively shortly. I should emphasise that the inquiry provided you with a series of documents, and there is relatively little reference in the documents that you saw to hepatitis. Did you know at the time about the infection of people through blood and blood products with hepatitis viruses, hepatitis B and hepatitis C, or non-A, non-B hepatitis, as it was known in late 80s?
No, I knew nothing about that, but it would be logical that they would, unfortunately, that would happen because their operation would not be that distinctive from HIV, and one imagines that untreated blood would be a transmission device for hepatitis as well as HIV, yeah.
But do I understand your answer correctly? But to the best of your knowledge, you can't remember being involved in any issues relating to...
I can't remember. No, and don't forget, the blood products issue was not my ministerial responsibility. I merely stuck my nose in because of my desire to have a useful impact on a favourable settlement of the HIV claims. So I wouldn't have done any. I wouldn't have really got involved in hepatitis, for all my awareness that, of course, that hepatitis potentially is a killer as much as HIV was.
But that is behind a further question that has been put forward, which is this: that with retrospect, was it a mistake to separate hepatitis from AIDS, given the similarity of transmission between the two?
Yes, I don't feel I'm well equipped to answer that, but I do see the point.
Do you remember if you were ever consulted about a national vaccination campaign for hepatitis B?
No.
Just coming back then to, again, to the announcement of the proposal for the HIV settlement. I rather mangled the question that was put forward to me earlier, and I'll give it a second go.
Really? I didn't notice that, but I probably mangled my answers.
No, no, you're
at this stage in the day, I think everyone's mangling everything, but there you are.
No, you answered very directly a question that I asked, but it was the wrong question, so it's a mea culpa.
Very honest admission. I never used to do that in the House of Commons. Yeah.
It's contrary to rumours about lawyers. I asked about the notice that the Prime Minister would have to give about making an oral statement in the House of Commons as of December 1990. The question that was put forward is actually about the amount of time in advance Mr. Waldegrave would have had to have given, how much advance notice he would have to have given about a written ministerial statement.
Well, the written ministerial statement permission has to be I'm just trying to wait a minute. I'm in danger of garbling this. A written ministerial statement. No, I think he could make it. I mean, he would have to agree it with the relevant authorities that control the business of the House. If we're talking about a statement made through Parliament, but generally speaking, the whole idea is with government. You want, and it gets worse as the years roll on. If you've got something to say, it's best to say it quickly before someone has a chance to distort or leak it.
It wasn't the case then that he would have had to have given 24 hours of notice or more?
Not as far as I know. And no, I mean, I would say whatever he had to say, he could go and say. But I mean, obviously, what that may be being confused with is if you're making an announcement on policy of serious consequence, you would be expected to consult certain colleagues, and certainly number 10 if it was something of substance.
Those are the questions that have been put forward and that I have for you. I turn now to the chair to see if he has any questions.
Yes, well, I've got questions really in three areas. The first is, can I be assured that what you said, my note of what you said was this: I never believed that £10 million was ever going to be enough. I did say that when you get within 2 to 3 years of spending that, they can come back for more.
They then would have to apply for more, yes.
Now, I want to ask you two things arising out of that comment. The first comes from your witness statement. Can we have that up on the screen, please? It's 7068000115. It's paragraph 3.13 for you, Mr. Mellor. It's page 14 and 15.
Yes,
And it's page 15 I want to ask you about. This is talking about the payment. And what you say in this, and it would be dreadful if it were misunderstood by people who read it and hadn't taken into account the answer which I just reminded you of. As far as I can recall, nobody suggested to me at this stage that a one-off payment of 10 million would not be sufficient to meet the needs of the intended beneficiaries.
That's right, but I'm talking about what I thought.
That's what I imagined. So this was a decision you reached yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought it would be adequate. And you know, if other people disagreed, well, so be it. I'm sure there must have been others who agreed, but I don't think it was the common parlance of, you know, correspondence or whatever. But I never felt it would be enough.
So why was it, do you think, that you independently, with no whispers in your ear, came to the view it wouldn't be enough?
It just seemed, when you actually look at where 10 million goes, with the number of potential claimants, it's never going to be enough.
It's less than £10,000 each.
Exactly. You're better at the mathematics of it than I am, but yes. No, but that's the point. I mean, you're absolutely right. That's the point. Is that ever really going to be enough? And we're not talking about 1 year. We're talking about a lifetime. No.
For them and for their dependents and relatives.
Exactly, as we've just been discussing. No, it was never going to be enough, was it? Never.
The second point that arises out of the same comment is your passage about saying, well, they could come back and ask for more. Is it right that that was never actually put in writing to the Trust, nor was a ministerial statement made to that effect?
Well, I can't remember going over it, but I think they were assured that you're the master of what I think, aren't you, of what I said? But I'm sure I did say that we were, where did what's the paragraph where I said that they have got, they should come back in 2 or 3 years? Maybe one of my officials said on my behalf.
If I can assist, the position, so far as the inquiry understands it, is that there was an exchange of letters in draft form between Mr. Heppel and the trustees of the Mcfarland Trust. At the time when Mr. Mellor left office at the Department of Health, that exchange had taken place, and we saw the document which said that.
Yes, we did.
In terms of a final letter, I have not yet been able to find one. What I am not sure about is, one, whether there ever was a final letter that went and was published, or two, whether, and this is a possibility, that events overtook this exchange, because in November there was the additional 20 to 24 million pounds.
So the problem may arise, the people who are talking about a draft exchange of letters never actually get a letter, if that's the case. I've yet to hear. Might think, well, something's changed.
No, I think that, I mean, first of all, for them to pay the 24 million had showed an alacrity rare in such circumstances. My only wish throughout all of this was to try to assure much more through the interaction between officials and members of the Mcfarland Trust that, you know, they really were, and I think I do say it in the correspondence, they have to judge on the merits what they think ought to be paid out, and not to worry about whether there'd be enough money to do it or whether they have to split it in half because of that. It's a high crime and misdemeanor to say in 5 years' time the Treasury will give you some more money. That is really a sort of an executing offence. But I always believed that it was appropriate to say, when the moment comes, you should be able to put forward a claim for a top-up with confidence. But then that was overtaken by events when the 24 million was paid across. So.
Yes, I see. Thank you. The second really arose from one of the may have been a passing comment you made, but you were talking about the fears that people had at the time that you were Secretary, that you were Minister of State for Health, about the possibility of an AIDS pandemic.
Yes.
And you said that the best approach, and it's that word I want to ask you about, the best assumption was that it could get very bad.
Yes.
Now, anyone just looking at that in isolation would say, well, the best assumption it would be very bad, wouldn't understand it in isolation. But you're saying best because that was presumably...
Well, I mean, the best assumption for... Yeah, probably best was a better word I should have found best. But the right assumption to formulate policy on was not to assume it would not be very serious, because it really was not possible to say at that point what was going to happen here in the UK, or indeed in Europe more generally. And there's no doubt that in Africa, heterosexual transmission was on a far higher percentage scale than it ever was here, which was just as well. But then, there was always, without wanting to sort of offend anybody here, there was always the issue about anal sex between heterosexuals, which of course was itself a potential risk area. And the more prevalent that was in the society, the more likely it was that AIDS would spread.
I suppose then that the approach that you would have taken naturally in your position for any serious threat to the public health would be to err always on the side of the worst. Plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things we never got a chance to talk about was the efforts that we made to try to reach out to communities at risk in a way that merely sought to offer them practical advice as to how to avoid the risk of transmission, and not, as so many people wanted us to do, which was kind of moralize on the subject, and one or two of we had, my brain is going to let me down, but we had a leading Hollywood film director doing some of our ads because he felt committed to the cause. Now I'm going to humiliate myself by forgetting his name, but I mean, really an Oscar-winning chap. And I went to see him filming down at the Elephant and Castle, some of these things. What worried me was it was going to look so good, it was going to slightly destroy the whole idea, which was that everything should look awful. But we did try and use only the best resources to get across what the risks people ran, and not to say, you shouldn't be doing this anyway. So there were plenty of people in Parliament, and I suspect at least one denizen of number 10 who probably felt that.
Well, I can't think who you mean.
The cat. Sure they had a cat in those days. Yes, I think they did.
But so the object really is to make sure that you take whatever precautions can be taken in case the worst might actually
because
be
there's
so.
no. But I mean, but if I quoted, I think, because they kindly sent over to me this interview in a local southwest London newspaper, and I think I read into the record the last 2 paragraphs of this interview, where I really did try and say that there was no reason to think there would be a happy outcome out of all of this. But then, miraculously, it didn't spread, and of course, even more miraculously, the ability to contain the impact. The first thing to try to do, obviously, is to stop people becoming HIV positive. But then, when you are HIV positive, then happens? And of course, in those days, it was felt there was it would inevitably lead on to full-blown AIDS. But fortunately, that was controlled much quicker than any of us would have dared hope for.
In the last exchange, when you were talking about certain denizens of number 10 and so on, brings me to my third question, which is to do with stigma. You were keen, as I understand your evidence, to deal with people as they were, with the infections that they had, and to see the health services treating those infections and preventing them as best it could. Do you have any suggestions as to how stigma, as it developed, the stigma of having AIDS, which could be made any better? You yourself, I think, told us that you went with Princess Diana.
Yes, she was, and she was very keen that this should be publicised. And in fact, I remember one visit to the Kobler Centre at St Stephen's Hospital, and there were people there in the terminal stages, and she was hugging them. And photographers were taking photographs where the patients didn't mind. And because, there were plenty of times when people were genuinely worried that even being in the same room as someone who was HIV positive posed a threat. And the danger was that people who are HIV positive were going to be treated like lepers. They were going to be treated, unclean. And there was no reason ever to think that. But she was probably the best person that I've ever come across who knew what had to be done to reassure people. And for me, it remains, an abiding memory of how extraordinary she was.
Well, apart from public figures such as her, showing that they themselves are not stigmatizing those who have an illness, how best do you suggest, albeit from your brief experience in the health department of health, how best do you suppose that stigma can be combated?
Well, I think the law has a role to play in stigma, that people should not be allowed to be turned down for insurances or various things like that, if just because they've got, a virus. And I think there is a role for the law in all of that. And I don't actually, when I look back on it, I think there was less stigma than I feared that there would be at the beginning of all of this. And I think now, there was a time people didn't want to shake hands with someone who was HIV positive. They didn't want anything to do with them. And of course, that I was perhaps too kind to Nicholas Winterton. More I think about that question of his about children when they've got it, whatever, would lead up to, well, children who are HIV positive shouldn't be allowed to be educated in normal places. And I think that I think that people are afraid of what they don't understand, and that fear can soon become a rejection of those people who have got HIV. And I think we did, overall, the government, various stripes of government, did quite well in combating that. Though we never persuaded Mrs. Thatcher to go and hug a victim of AIDS, but then I never dared even ask.
Those are all the questions that I have.
So there is one question which has been brought to my attention, and again it's a mea culpa from me, because I asked you generally about the consideration that you gave to partners of people with AIDS in terms of Mcfarland Trust and the HIV settlement.
Yes.
Specifically, what about wives and partners who had contracted AIDS as a result of their relationships with people with haemophilia?
Yeah.
How significant an issue was that in your mind?
Well, I can appreciate it is a significant issue. I don't remember ever specifically having to deal with that, but obviously it's an issue. Of course it is.
So unless there's anything from you arising from that, I will turn to Ms. Gray and see if she has any questions. She doesn't. Mr. Mellor, with all of the witnesses, there is an opportunity at the end of your evidence for you to say or address anything else that you would like to do so.
No, I think it's been useful and rather, I mean, it's easy to forget these things, and I found being reminded of how awful it was quite instructive. And but, you know, I think we're in, if I dared think 30 years ahead where we would be from when we were plunged into the dealing with AIDS, I would probably settle for where we are now. But that doesn't mean there isn't suffering on an impossible scale. But I think the advances in medical science, in terms of being able to deal with the point at which HIV positive becomes full-blown AIDS, I think they've done remarkably well on that. And it doesn't mean that people don't have a negative impact on their health, particularly with the strength of some of the treatments they have to take. But a lot of people are alive today who have been HIV positive for a long time, who I would not have expected to be in that situation when we were considering the evidence as it was coming in. So I think this is quite, I mean, the story, it can never be a happy story. It's a profoundly unhappy story, but the endings appear to be better than might have been predicted 30 years ago.
Mr. Mellor, thank you very much.
Well, it's for me to thank you, particularly after such a long day. And I'd like to thank you really for, in the first place, providing such a well-ordered, if I may say so, and clear witness statement.
Which... I had some help with that, but those who did it, I mean, that was all my thoughts, but it was turned into coherence by them. So they're hearing what you say. So.
Well, I'm pleased about that. Certainly your oral evidence has not been in the least mangled. Rather, it's brought to life what you had to say in the witness statement, and
well, thank you.
In a colourful way, often embellished with your observations and your anecdotes. I may have to consider how relevant some of the anecdotes are to what I have to decide.
Oh, of course, they're not relevant, but the whole idea is, you know, you want to try and make it worth people's while listening rather than just droning on, you know. And so I thought I would do my best to be interesting, and hopefully the liveliness was not at the expense of the accuracy.
No, I'm sure it enlivened it for all of us. The one question I didn't ask, I'm not going to detain you, I don't want an answer,
No, I'm fine.
Is when in one of your side observations you described Mr. Justice Ognall as a serious High Court judge. And it might suggest that you thought some High Court judges aren't, but I shall leave the question there.
You know, it's like everything. People have different reputations, don't they? But I always thought him saying it probably was more significant than one or two people saying it, who also sit on the bench. You know, it's a sort of the human zoo. It contains many different sorts of animals, doesn't it?
Well, I think we should leave it there. Tomorrow.
So tomorrow we have John Patton, Lord Patton.
Lord Patton at 10 o'clock in the morning. 10 o'clock.